I will call to order the Finance Buildings and Grounds Committee meeting, which was duly noticed on November 17th, 2023 through posting and notification of the press in accordance with Wisconsin Statute 19.84. Any safety shares of things we have done that we should have done differently, safety related, or anything that sticks out?
Drive east, not west at this time of the day.
It'd be nice if we could do that.
It's that sun. Ooh.
I would have enjoyed that trip. I'd get a trip around the world that way. Nobody? Nobody. Everybody's been behaving from a safety standpoint. All right. Well, I have a couple of things. First of all, as we think safety, we have to always think about where am I at and what am I doing? And after you do that, it's how could, what I'm doing, how could it hurt me or how could it hurt others? And the next thought is, how do I protect myself and protect others? Next thing is, as we think about Thanksgiving that's coming up, and the day after, people often turn toward decorating for Christmas, and some maybe today as I see the hallways and things being done. But I want to particularly call attention, not with all of the holiday items, but in particularly ladder safety. And it sticks out to me as I think about hearing the stories over the years of people falling off ladders, hitting their heads, and passing away. And it happens, it doesn't matter. I think of Ken Hendricks. It doesn't matter how much money you have. I mean, he's a billionaire and shouldn't have been on a ladder. And that's how I look at that, but yet it happened. A gentleman that I worked with was a beloved, great guy within our work environment. He was putting something away in his attic, and the ladder tipped over, and he fell down and hit his head. So I'm pretty, as I think about that, and I think about, all right, first of all, there are no decorations I'm putting up that I need a ladder for, because I'm going to eliminate that hazard. But some people still do that. So with that in mind, if you do not have the proper ladder or any other equipment such as a lift to safely hang decorations, acquire the proper equipment or have them professionally hung. Avoid shortcuts. Plan and make sure you have the necessary training for whatever you're using. If it's a lift, which is really cool to use, but just make sure you have the proper training to use those things. Properly inspect your ladder and other equipment. Always have someone else work with you when you hang lights or decorations from a ladder or roof. Plan for needed fall protection or work positioning equipment. To reach a roof, extend the ladder at least 3 feet beyond the edge of the roof. Avoid getting on, avoid getting on the roof unless you really need to. Make sure the ladder is on a secure and level footing before you climb. Place the base of the ladder 1 foot away from the wall for every 4 feet of ladder height. Stay centered between the rails of the ladder. Do not overreach up or to the side to hang lights or decorations. Move the ladder instead. So just that sticks out for me as we think about ladder safety. There's a whole lot of other decorating items that we don't really want to follow Clark Griswold for holiday decorating safety tips. So I say that, so it was one particular work group was responsible for a safety meeting, and it was to point out all of the hazards within Christmas vacation. So it was a rather unique safety meeting that we went through some years ago.
I bet it was long, too.
Well, it was long. They were shortening their work day for sure, but it did point out all of the opportunities really for us to be safe. So, anything else from a safety thought or topic? Okay, seeing none, is there a motion to adopt the November 21st, 23 Finance, Buildings, and Grounds Committee agenda?
So moved. Second.
All right, motion by John, second by Carl. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
That passes unanimously. Next, presentation of the fiscal year 23-24 year-to-date, which is August and September. Financial summaries and consider approval to move to the full board. Mr. McCray.
Thank you very much. Included in your packet, as referenced by Commissioner Ardrey, are the August and September financials. As I typically say every month, right, these are not particularly exciting items to review, but it's important that we do so. It's also a great opportunity to highlight some of the nuances of school finance. And if you go to the September financials, and particularly the expenses, you will see 2 debt payments in Fund 38 and in Fund 39, right? And just a reminder to those who are watching, as well as the committee, in September, we make interest-only payments, and in March, we make principal payments and interest. So that's just some of the fluctuations, if you will, or variances related to debt service within school district financials. You'll also notice, right, in your keen observation that expenses are far outpacing revenues. In September, we did receive our first quarterly equalization aid payment. We are a heavily aided school district to the tune of 63% of our revenue limit authority. It's a significant dollar value. But again, if you're monitoring, which I'm sure you are, as we move through October, as we move into November, and as the board in its diligence authorized this last board meeting a line of credit, we do so in part because our expenses this time of the year outpace our revenues. And you're starting to see that even in July, August, and September. Any questions from the committee?
Okay, seeing no questions, I would have a comment. Not quite monthly, but it would be a little more exciting if we had a dashboard to review.
Very fair. Commissioner Ardrey, you've been asking for that dashboard that I debuted like 3 years ago for 3 years. So yes, just to create some visual, to the point, the numbers are great. The numbers tell a story. We'll talk a little bit about that earlier in terms of the story that data is telling, right? But that visual, right, to make these a little more not only friendly for the board and the committee, but also the general public as well.
Well, it tells a great story, not just from the numbers, so. Great. Next item, update on long-range facilities master planning. Mr. McCray.
And I think, Dave Leader and I just really wanted to keep this on the agenda. It's part of the full board agenda. It's also part of the finance, buildings, and ground agenda to keep not only the committee continually informed, the board continually informed, but for those who are by chance happening to tune into our YouTube channel. Right, so this past November 14th, there was a very lengthy presentation by Epstein Ewan and J.P. Cullen, and a little bit from point of beginning. Epstein Ewan Architects is doing the educational adequacy as well as the technical assessment within their engineering group of our buildings. Right, J.P. Cullen is our partner along the way to provide, if you will, as time comes, some cost estimates. Keep in mind that a report that the committee will be receiving initially in December is just really an assessment of current conditions, right? It is not a vision report of what we would like. It's an assessment of what we currently have and identifying positives as well as perhaps any deficiencies within our infrastructure as well as our educational adequacy, which you got a great review of back on November 14th. Keep in mind throughout the process, and I believe administratively, we appreciate the board's patience, like what is the end? We work through a process, and currently there's a technical assessment. Currently there's, again, the educational adequacy. There's a review of our site, including our athletic facilities, those we own two of which we do not, right? But we need to have an assessment of that because someone perhaps may need to make an investment, right? And that's just part of the board and the community's overall evaluation of those two sites. I'm speaking specifically of Riverside as well as Monterey Stadium. Riverside for varsity baseball, Monterey for track, as well as football for both Craig and Parker. Right, so you'll receive in December, again, a high-level summary. Right, the board then in January will receive, again, a little bit more of an in-depth workshop, and then we'll continue on as the timeline that was shared in the board packet and included again in this packet, to keep you abreast of the process. So just really trying to keep it on the forefront.
Okay, thank you. Mr. McCray, any questions, comments from the committee? Okay,
Yeah, I do.
go ahead, Carl.
I have a small one. As we look at these timelines and we look at technically the current period we're in, somewhere we're going to have to look at the future timelines that we suggest might be necessary. When would we be targeting for that?
If I'm tracking correctly, I believe that's a great question, right? So, a couple things. As you know, Superintendent Holtzman is taking a community group with some board members, including yourself, through a strategic planning process. Right? So we envision the long-range master facility plan as a component of that process, complementing it perhaps. Right, I would say most likely, right, you will begin to have some of those after the initial revelation of data, the assessment, right. The next steps are, right, and that's where I would say the discussion begins to what is a phased approach to whatever the board and the community wish to address. And so, we can't say, right, and this was somewhat hinted to, and we've not been shy, right? So we have an operational referendum renewal that administratively, I believe we're supporting the board deeply consider, taking to the voters in November of 2024. That decision needs to be made 75 days prior to the election date, so that's August. And then is there potential, similar to what we did this past go-around, to issue debt, to have a second question on the ballot? Again, that's the board's decision based upon an administrative and perhaps community input as well. If I'm, again, tracking correctly, and I may not be, right, and I'll surrender the microphone in just a few seconds, Commissioner Darmerhausen.
You're okay.
Is my guess is should the board consider going for debt in November or at any time, it is step one in a multiple step journey to address our facility issues.
Okay. You've got the right idea. What I'm looking at, is there a possibility of sitting down and putting together not only what we absolutely need, but we could use and what we would like to have, and then take and see those stacked and say, this we can do now, this will have to go into the future. Those kind of things. There's a lot of things, as we saw at the meeting last night, redesign of classrooms and other things. Well, they're all nice, but are there things before we get to that point, and would that be put off, or is that something that'll happen as we go along? Now, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here, but I'm kind of interested in hearing all these things.
Yeah, and I think, right, as you look to keep in mind, in January, the board will have a workshop in terms of the assessment being revealed, right? At the end of January, right, JP Cullum will provide you with a high-level rough order of magnitude in terms of to address, the deficiencies, right? What would that cost, right? Now that you have, this is what we have and this is what we have or don't have to pay for it, right? What's our next step? And that's where the scope and prioritization, and probably prioritization and scope, right, chicken or egg, come into play next, right? It's that'll be facilitated not by me, thankfully, right, but by our good friends at Cullen and EUA, right? but there's lots on the table. You're going to hear some of that at the, at the next agenda item, right? How do we begin to address our deficiencies, right? One, probably what drives it is scope and prioritization, if you will, married with what is the tolerance or the affordability.
Before we put a price tag in that on, I'd
Right.
like to see all the different things that
So-
we would like to have, what we absolutely need to have,
Yeah.
that thing. And then we go down after we prioritize those and say, but this is what it's gonna cost.
Correct, and just to the assessment of what we have will be priced out, right? Then with that, you're gonna go, right, that becomes a point of evaluation as to whether or not the price associated with a particular improvement is worthwhile, or is an improvement going to outweigh, right,
Yeah.
improving the assessment.
Thank you. We're on the same page.
We are, right? The process is a little bit organic, right? Only because we need it to be, and it's too early to be wedded to a solution. As a committee and as a board, right, you have to allow the process to evolve naturally, guided, granted, but evolve naturally to where it is a well thought out question, perhaps via a community survey, right? And then feedback again garnered for the board's consideration via that instrument. And then, right, July, August, what is it that the board may wish or not wish to put forward to the voters for consideration in November or not?
Actually, I do have a comment on this too. And I would say, Carl, so keep in mind when we look at the time frame, and one of the critical pieces that we've been working toward as a committee is gathering I'll say the boundaries of all the information. So part of I say boundary, recognizing that we won't necessarily expect any continued declining enrollment for students. Well, that's important. So as we look at the students that we have, we would expect similar numbers over the next 10-year period. So with that in mind, we do know there are some critical things that we have to think about. The age of the buildings, they don't get newer if they're not replaced. So that is a no. We don't need an assessment to know that part. The assessments and things give us more information, but we don't know that. So, I mean, that's one critical piece. So probably from a committee and a board standpoint, we're going to have an abundance amount of information to be able to then decide where do we want to go. If you think about the last debt issuance that we did, we had the exercise of determining what was our priority. If you remember being at Adams and we moved and we determined what was our priority at that point. Now, maybe we do a similar, but we'll have even more data to work with. So I think the answer to your question becomes soon, but we won't have all of the likes, because how do we get all the likes? I would like to replace every building that's older than me, because I'm not old, so therefore. But that isn't necessarily a realistic piece. But we know even from the assessments that were done in the past, we were well over $100 million.
Right.
Just looking at to fix what we had. Well, the costs haven't gone down, but things have gotten older. So I think we will, as we look at assessment and continuing to feed the long-range plan, really gets us to our next topic, unless there's any more comments on this. Information on indoor air quality monitoring. Mr. McCray, Mr. Leader.
There we go. So we'll have some associates of ours step up and do a presentation that was included in the packet, but I really wanted to set the stage for a little bit. Then you'll have the presentation from our folks from McKinstry. And then Dave Leader will kind of close out in terms of some immediate next steps that his team, under his leadership, are looking to undertake or have been undertaking in preparation to address an issue that we knew exists. So I want to talk a little bit about the importance of data, right? I referenced that earlier, and within the data, there's a story to be told. And you may say, well, what story is IAQ telling us? Well, it's telling us about the performance of our mechanicals within our buildings. It's telling us about CO2. It's telling us about indoor air temp. It's telling us about humidity. All right, but it's also telling us about that learning environment within that school building. Right, so what is it like within a classroom? What is it like within the building? And is it the best learning environment for our students and for our faculty and staff to provide students instruction, right? And so I'm not going to steal a great deal of thunder from Scott Johnson as he presents, and Kevin Korn and Nick Wabish as well, right? We'll let them tell the report findings. I do want to give a shout out to former Superintendent Steve Pufall. He and I were chatting one time, and he's like, maybe we should be monitoring. You're like, that's a great idea. Like, what do we do, right? So Dave and I, picked up the phone, called our friends at McKinstry and said, this is a little bit up your alley, right? How can you help us monitor these three elements, indoor air quality, temperature, and humidity within our buildings? So they have a software, they have the instruments in which to do it, right? And they're a known commodity to us, right? So we engage them to perform the work that you're seeing. We wanted to look at our 12 elementaries. Right, because please keep in mind, only 11 of the 12 have conditioned air. Right, we used Edison as we were able to bring things online, and we started this journey almost 12 months ago. Right, you'll see in the graphs we have some gaps for Edison. We had some kind of tech issues, right? But eventually we wanted to include Edison, right? And a shout out to Commissioner Ardrey for that suggestion, because that's a building that has the newest set of mechanicals within the district, right? And so that work was performed by SiteLogic UNESCO, right, back in 2018, right? So we brought that up. Keep in mind, right, that was under an Act 32 energy exemption, to which you're looking for energy savings, right, hopefully improvement, but it's not moving to a conditioned air environment, right? That's what we're doing now using ESSER funds, right, at Franklin Middle School, right? So eventually, all of our secondaries, Franklin was the last to have conditioned air. We have one elementary, and we have 11 elementaries that do not, right? So as we roll out the EUA report, right, this is another set of data, right, for the board's consideration. We'll touch it on EUA, but this is extremely technical, right? And Scott will reveal that. Reveal is the software, by the way, that they use to capture the data, right, in terms of what you'll see. So really look at those graphs, right? It's an interesting story. And I'll turn it over to Scott and his team, right? That'll be followed up by Dave.
So just for those that may be viewing this, IAQ is indoor air quality. It's in the realm in which we're in, it's easy just to go with that acronym, and we all know, but if you don't know, now you know.
Thank you. Will this work?
Yes,
Yes,
the down
okay.
button.
All right. Hello, everyone. Oh, sorry. It's a little loud. Yes, thank you for the introduction to the indoor air quality acronym. What screens are you all looking at? So when I point to things, if I can direct your eyes? It's, okay, all right. All right, so as an overview for the past year, we've deployed some of these devices on the left that you'll see in this slide. They're really battery operated, they're wireless, they're placed throughout the different schools in the chart here, or in the table. On the left, you have the school where we place the sensors. And then we're doing temperature and humidity monitoring in 4 of the spaces within each of these schools. And you can see the various classrooms and spaces that we chose to put sensors. That was based on the guidance and working with Dave Leader and his team. And then on the right side, you'll see carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide sensors are placed in 2 rooms out of each school. So just an overview of where we put sensors located throughout the school. So what we did is we compiled for this school year. We started with summer school. We pulled a week June 12th to June 16th. And before I get into the chart, I want to explain, we'll start with the top chart. There's a bunch of bars there. The blue bars are actually the average CO2 level in the space, looking at all the classrooms and where we have sensors averaged together. That's the average for 24/7 for June 12th to June 16th. And then we have a green dot. So the green dot is actually the highest average, I'm sorry, I gotta look at this, I can't see from here. All right, so the orange square is the highest single measurement. We're taking increments, we're measuring in 15-minute increments. So the highest 15-minute measurement is the orange square. The green dot is the highest afternoon average for a single day in that time frame. So the reason why we chose afternoon average for a single day is because imagine a room like this with students in it. You'd start out in the morning, you start out with air that has less CO2. As we breathe, we're exhaling CO2. It builds up in the space over throughout the day, and it peaks in the afternoon. So the ventilation system in the space is intended to turn the air over, provide fresh air, exhaust old air out, and keep that CO2 level at a level that's more conducive to a learning environment. Now, there's specific standards and different studies that are out there, but nobody's come out and said, like, you need to have a CO2 level at a certain level in a classroom, but there are studies that show in between 1,000 and 2,000 parts per million. That's when students start to feel drowsy. That's when, in the afternoon, it can affect the learning environment and how well they pay attention and focus to what's being taught in the classroom. So on the chart, you'll see there's two dashed lines. The bottom dashed line is approximately what outside air CO2 is. That's the best CO2 level that you can breathe. So that's the bottom, that's the ideal state. The top line is 1,200 parts per million. So I went up a little bit from that 1,000 parts per million that I referenced earlier. I set it at 1,200. And you can see across all the data we collected for June 12th to 16th, every single one of these schools is within range. So things to keep in mind here is that the school isn't as occupied in the summer. But as we're looking at this in the summer, there's no issues to point out here. We move down to the green chart in the middle. Now we're looking at space temperature. So space temperature, we're looking at the same data. So the green bar is the average over that whole time frame. The orange is the highest temperature during the occupied times of the school. And the green is the green is the average temperature during the occupied times of the time frame. So we're looking at from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. roughly. What's the highest single measurement and what's the average of that with those dots? And then the dashed lines are the same. So we've got a low target that the district tries to maintain within their schools. It's 68 degrees and the high is at 74 degrees, especially in cooling season. So you can see now you start creeping up. You see Adams Elementary, the average, and then the highest point. There's some pretty high temperature measurements. On average, when it's occupied, it's 76 up to 78. You start seeing some of these other schools as you move left to right that are up above the line of where you would want it to be. So again, if you start thinking about comfort and when you're in a seminar or doing something outside of whatever you do for a living and you're trying to pay attention to something and it's hot in the classroom or hot in the environment, then you start thinking about that, maybe not focusing on what's going on and what you're trying to listen to. And from a humidity standpoint, there's really no humidity issues at this point. The only thing I would keep an eye on is Kennedy. It's still on average within range, but there are some points where the humidity does creep up as far as the single highest measurement that goes above the line of 60% and the low of 30%. So there's a lot to talk about on this one slide. We're going to go through this. There's other weeks that we'll look at, and the data shows a different story, so I'll take you through that, but I just wanted to set the stage on what we're looking at, and if you had any questions on that before we jump in. Sure.
During the week of the 12th through the 16th, there are students in the classroom during those times, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Because obviously, people in a building versus people out of the building make a difference.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So, Mr. Hannawell, we wanted to be sure to capture summer school, which is why we selected June. Because we have a very robust summer school, and we hope to continue to enhance our summer school programming in the community.
Any other questions? No? Okay. So then we get into the back-to-school prep week, so that's August 28th to September 1st. We're looking at the same sets of data. Again, this is, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no students, it's more teachers getting ready for school at this point?
Except on,
Orientation or,
right, so September 1st, we do see students, and then we had some back-to-school events prior to September 1st. But then essentially, to Scott's point, right, this is when we have faculty and staff preparing their classrooms, attending professional development at their building level in preparation for the launch of the school year.
so then we start looking at CO2, it's still all within range. There are more issues that crop up with temperature in many of the schools in this week. You can see the average temperature in the space, whether it's occupied or not, is higher than the 74-degree mark for most schools. And then when it is occupied during those daytime hours, the temperature creeps up even higher with some high measurements up to the 80-degree mark. So that's, yep, yes.
This is real hard for me to understand, but wouldn't it just logically be that, I mean, beginning of June, it's, barring an anomaly, it's really not that hot yet. By the time you reach the end of August, it's hot outside, so our building temperatures are gonna be hotter anyways, correct?
Well, it depends on the cooling and what's going on within the space to cool the inside of the building. So the air conditioning systems should be running and maintaining a temperature that's between 68 and 74. And
So what the goal would be, it wouldn't matter whether it's June, July, August, or October, we would want that temperature in the classroom to be constant.
yes,
Thank you.
Yes.
Now that makes sense.
and then as we look at humidity, most of them are all within range. Humidity is going to be a big factor on the comfort in the space, so they're within range, except, again, Kennedy, looking at that school, it's at the upper end of the range, and the high measurements are still higher than the others. Any questions on this slide?
Why would that be? I mean, Kennedy's a pretty new school.
So we're going to go into the next steps here.
Okay.
I don't, yeah, I know Dave and will address some of that.
I can address that right now if you'd like. So obviously Kennedy is our only A-seed school, right? So within that system, when we're in a cooling phase, we should have reheat coils as well. So that means your boiler has to be on, right? So you gotta add heat, if you will, to combat the humidity. We have huge issues at Kennedy with that system. We have a lot of, they're called groove lock fittings that from day one when they were installed didn't hold up to the design of the system. So anytime we hit a certain temperature or pressure, these things would leak. So we had to basically take that offline.
So in order to dehumidify a space, you have to cool the air down to like 55 degrees. And if you can't heat it back up to a temperature that's comfortable, you can't just, deploy 55-degree air all the time into a space, you'll overcool it. In order to keep the temperature within the range that it needs to be, they're not using the reheat, and they're not cooling it as far down as they could to remove moisture. All right, any questions on this one? So then we started looking at school weeks. We started with September 11th to 15th on this next slide. You'll see at the top chart, the average CO2 level looks good, but then you start seeing some of these CO2 levels creep up. In this slide, the afternoon averages are still within range, but you're starting to see the highest measured point creep up over the high range of 1,200 parts per million. So something to keep an eye on as we roll through this. The temperatures, again, September 11th to 15th, it's still relatively warm out. You still have some of those same temperature issues. Some of them aren't as exaggerated as they were before, but they're still there for many of the schools. And then humidity is still showing the same picture, although some of those high humidity levels are creeping up to the high range, but Kennedy's still higher than all the others. Any questions on this slide? All right. So then we get to school week 2, October 9th to 13th. And we're trying to find school weeks where there's, a full week of school and not institute days or holidays and whatnot. But October 9th to 13th, we start looking at the CO2, and you can see many of them are within range, but then you see 3 that stand out. Adams, the afternoon average is above 1,200, with the highest point at that 1,500 to 1,600 mark. Monroe had some high CO2, as well as Van Buren had the afternoon average isn't as high, but the single highest reading is almost 2,000 parts per million. So you start creeping up. And I just want to make a clarification here when it comes to CO2. None of this is a health and safety issue. It's more of a focus issue. You'd have to have way, way higher levels of CO2 for it to be a safety issue. The next chart on the middle one, when we're looking at temperature, you can see as the temperature's gotten milder and we're in October, a lot of these temperatures get back down into the range they should be. No real temperature issues here. Washington a little bit cooler, but that could, it's a little bit lower than the low level, but we're starting to go the opposite way, where the temperatures were higher before, and now they're starting to drop down within range, with now Washington being a little cooler than the others. And then humidity, as the turn into fall, the fall season, the humidity level has dropped significantly. All of these schools are within range consistently during this week. On the next slide, October 23rd to the 27th, we're looking at CO2 levels. Again, we've got Adams peaking pretty high, an afternoon average of about 1,600 parts per million, and the highest measurement about 1,800. Roosevelt still has some high CO2 level measurements, and Van Buren also goes over, but the afternoon averages at those schools are within range of, and just to point out, 1,200 is typically a higher range than you would want to control to, but trying to allow for more conservative view of this. As far as temperature goes, we've got some temperature issues in Washington and Wilson at this point. But they're still on average within range. There's some high measurements that are much higher than the others for a single moment in time, but when it's occupied, the occupied average is within range. Humidity, it creeps up. It's, some of these weeks in October have been pretty warm. So October 23rd to 27th, if I remember, right before Halloween, it was pretty abnormally warm. So we're talking temperatures in the 70 mark outside at this point. There are some higher humidity levels across the board this week, so in all these schools. But on average, within range, just the high humidity measurement is above range. So any question on this slide? So in summary, some of the key.
Question, Scott.
Oh, yes.
So, and I want to do to get through all of the data.
Yes.
As far as the location of the centers, because one might think that they were just maybe randomly chosen places, but how were the locations chosen to measure?
So from our standpoint, it was on the recommendation of Dave and his team. So I'll let Dave speak to that.
Yeah, so my recommendation was to put one sensor on the east, west, north, and south sides of the buildings to try to get a equal result, if you will. So that's how we strategically place those sensors.
Of course, I knew the answer. I thought that was important because if you just looked at the data, it sort of begs the question as, well, where are the sensors and how do we know that this was really how the building was operating? So that's what I wanted to make sure that came out. So, okay, thank you. You can go.
Dave, along those lines, does, north, south, east, west, I understand, but I was at Wilson yesterday at 9 in the morning. The classroom I was at was right on the second floor, but right up at the top of the stairs. How would that room differ from being down the hall, where you've got a room kind of down the hall that doesn't have, like a stairwell with air and stuff coming up? Does that make a difference in terms of the because that classroom was hot. I mean, that was a first grade classroom. In that classroom, I had a short sleeve shirt on and I was roasting in there. And yesterday was not a hot day.
Right, and that could be a control issue as well.
Okay.
For that particular classroom. Yes.
But wouldn't it make a difference, measuring the temperature in there where you had a stairwell coming? Because right at the bottom of that, the stairwell curves, but you've got the doors there coming open and shooting air up the stairs and stuff like that versus down the hall.
Right, hot air rises.
Okay.
It rises.
Okay.
I think you see that a lot. You look at Adams, you look at Washington, those older buildings, those second floors, they get hot.
Yeah. Okay.
So one of the things about Reveal software, right, is Dave can log in and track every minute of every day, right? So what we're trying to do really is convey averages, right? So if the sun rises in the east, right, and there's no, let's say, type of window shading or that, right, it's going to be much warmer. Is it a second floor, right? But to Dave's effort in working with McKinstry, right, to Commissioner Commissioner Ardrey's point, right, we strategically place them and we're monitoring averages. Not every classroom has it, right? We knew that we weren't going to put it in a classroom that was designed for small group instruction where we maybe have a half dozen students, right? We're looking at putting it in a kindergarten classroom where there are 21 students, or a fifth grade classroom where there are 26 students, right? So there are those variables. But again, the power of the tool, right, affords Dave the opportunity. He just can't sit at his computer and monitor every building every minute of the occupied day. One thing real quick, and right, I have a little side bet here with Superintendent Holzman that will be done in 60 minutes, and I'm going to lose that bet the more I continue to talk, right? But it's great discussion. Some things that Dave will talk about kind of some of the next steps from his perspective, but I just leaned over a little bit earlier and reminded Dave, like when we look at Lincoln, right, and we're looking at a southern exposure and their original 1958 single pane windows, right, that have probably a very low E value, right? What Dave and his team and working with the contractors, we're putting up some film, right, to help reduce the amount of sunlight pouring into that room, right, to therefore reduce the heat load, right? And now that's a step, that's not the only step, and that's just really a interim step, right, to a bigger question to address throughout our district's buildings.
So, just to summarize all the data, when the school is occupied, there's higher levels of CO2, especially at Adams, Monroe, and Van Buren, versus the other district schools. The CO2 levels, as I mentioned earlier, aren't dangerous, but they do cause students to lose focus, feel drowsy in the afternoon. So depending on what the teacher's trying to teach after lunchtime, it's probably harder to pay attention for students in some of those classrooms. Issues maintaining temperature range in the warmer weather conditions at many schools. Again, higher temperatures cause the students to feel uncomfortable, focus on their comfort and not what's being taught in the classroom. Higher humidity levels are measured, but on average, the humidity levels are within range. We should continue to monitor humidity at, I forgot what school it was, but at the ones, at Kennedy. So just to monitor that, just to make sure the average doesn't creep up over the high range and you end up with a mold mildew issue in the classrooms. Some of the factors that affect the data results is definitely number one is the occupancy of the space is the primary driver. You put a bunch of students in a classroom, it's gonna make the heat load go up that you have to cool. It's gonna increase the need for ventilation and removing CO2. So that's the number one driver. And then making sure that we have proper ventilation into those spaces to keep those CO2 levels within range. Some of the equipment age that's serving those classrooms might have reduced capability from what it was originally designed for. And then, again, the HVAC system design parameters may not be applicable to the use of the classroom today. Maybe it was designed for less students in the past, and there's more students in there now, and maybe it's just a mismatch of how the system's capabilities are with what the use is today. And then the other is just maintenance, making sure dampers are working, temperature sensors, you name it, on the control system.
I would say the one thing, and I noticed from the key themes, as we recognize the building designs, completely different designs. So it's not the case that it's Monroe, Madison, and Jackson, because that would have been a similar design, or Harrison and Van Buren, because those would have been similar designs. So, or all two-story buildings. So, I mean, it just shows that we can have higher CO2 levels everywhere. It just doesn't matter design-wise. So, and I'm even thinking about how the buildings physically are turned, and they are definitely different even within the different designs, and that's not showing up here. I thought it was just my.
So to add to that, some of the next steps, the dashboard where we have these sensors, we can expand the dashboard and what we're monitoring. So real-time monitoring of the building automation system once it's updated to monitor all the points that are controlling all the HVAC equipment and identify anomalies and why things might not be working, and alerting Dave's team so that they can address those issues in a prioritized manner. So continuous monitoring of the BAS, flagging issues 24/7 using algorithms to figure out what's working and what isn't. And not only just pointing out to what's working or what isn't, but doing a root cause analysis of what isn't working. So Dave and his team don't waste time trying to track down every single issue that pops up. They go into a building and they know what the issues are and they're prepared to deal with it. And it's a better use of their time to have a service that does root cause analysis on the back end for them. And then the other piece, as I hear you talk about the long-range planning effort and the data that's gonna come out of that from all the analysis that's going into all these schools of what equipment's there, how old it is, all of that. The Reveal dashboard has another module that information can be input into, and this information's now at your fingertips to prioritize and figure out what's important, what isn't, and understand what upgrades are on the horizon and what those look like over time and when they're gonna hit and when they're due and needed to be replaced for, equipment replacements over time. As a building ages, you have to update equipment over and over again to keep it up to speed. Retro commissioning is another one. This is going in and looking at all the equipment and making sure it's operating as it was intended to. Looking at the dampers and how they're working to make sure that you're getting the ventilation that you need. Taking measurements, looking at air volumes, understanding airflow in the space to make sure, you're getting the best needs out of or the best performance out of your HVAC system so that you don't have the indoor air quality issues. That's more of a technical study that can be subsidized with focus on energy incentives. So they have an entire program built around that, and a lot of school districts go through that from time to make sure the systems keep operating in the best way that they can. And then after that, there's the detailed engineering study to understand equipment capacity and capability, really evaluate airflows, capacities, the controls of the systems, and apply those to the current conditions. The useful life of equipment, looking for upgrades, control system upgrades, identify potential funding options as, trying to uncover grants, federal funding opportunities, how to pay for some of this through capital and operating budgets. But really take all this data, bring it all to the forefront so that you all can make decisions on how to invest in the schools into the future. Any questions?
After you said bring all the data to the forefront, you would, as a group, have recommendations for the long-range planning committee, the board and everything, because the average guy, and I'm hoping I speak, for people like myself, don't understand this. I mean, I understand what you've said today, but when you start talking about this, I mean, it's obviously it's a foreign language,
Yep.
so, if you give me all this data and say, now what do you want to do? I'm still gonna say, I haven't got the slightest idea, because half these things don't make any sense to me. I mean, when I was asking some early questions about what, Carl told me one thing that, there's a lot of glass over at Kennedy, and that makes a difference, Well, if that's not your level of expertise or understanding, I would hope the experts would then bring forth, after you've done all this data and gather and said, okay, here's the things, but we would recommend you really look at this,
Yes.
correct?
100%. We would even work with the team to prioritize everything to make sure that when the data is input into the reveal, for example, and you have assets, we want to make sure that everyone understands the importance of that asset, how it impacts the learning environment, and apply scores to those things so that you can really prioritize what the needs are of the school district and weigh trade-offs. Because at the end of the day, no school district I know can do everything that they want to do. And you have to do the things that you need to do and that are most important for the mission of the district. So we would definitely make those recommendations and work with the team to sort that out.
So, Mr. Hannawell, if I may, when you receive the high-level assessment, and I'll just pick on Adams as an example, right? So Dave will tell you that there's a boiler in Adams that was updated in next year. We're gonna tell you that maybe there's a building envelope issue. You're gonna hear that it's single-pane windows, right? You're gonna hear those high level. And you're gonna say, okay, well, what's that tell me? It tells you that Adams, based upon the data that the Reveal software provided by McKinstry about that learning environment, right? Now you hear about the windows, but what's the causation of single pane windows? What's the causation of original univentilators? What's the causation, right? And some of the causation is the data revealed with CO2, temperature, and humidity, right? So it's pulling all of that together, right? So you'll get an assessment, your car is bad. Well, why is my car bad? Well, your fuel economy is low, your tires are under pressure, right? And all the data versus it's just an old car. That's what we're hoping to do, is really marry the two things together. The overall high-level assessment and the data to support or not support the assessment.
So to put a visual with this, John, when we were walking around Monroe, and if you remember, we were talking about the building envelope and the double doors being open and all of that. Well, how does that play out? What we see here. So, because if managed the way the building's designed, we would see different numbers. Still may be high, but we would see different numbers. But as you said, so I'm gonna say the common people in schools don't necessarily understand the design and the impacts of their decisions. So as we think about the couple areas we went to, you could feel the temperature difference. Well, this is how the data proves that out for what we saw and felt. So just want to help tie that a little bit.
Well, and even when we went to Marshall in the, I don't remember what, was it the media center where the ceilings are already way up high and cobwebs and rust and everything. I mean, and we all talked informally, you know, how do you even think about fixing that? Well, you know, okay.
I think another good example would be buildings like Van Buren, right? So we put an addition on Van Buren back in 2005. If you go into any one of those areas, they have the newer equipment, right? You can feel a vast difference from the older area that still has the original air handling units, unit ventilators, if applicable, right? And that dates back to 1969. So that, you know, that, it's a huge difference, it really is.
If I may, since I've already lost the wager, as you pour through the data, right, and the graphs that Scott presented, right, so you'll see Kennedy is fairly constant, right? Everyone else is up and down, right? Kennedy's the only conditioned air elementary, right, as a reminder that we have. Dave acknowledged, right, there are probably still some things we can do to improve that environment in Kennedy, because what we're also not capturing quite yet is the energy efficiency of our buildings. We're really talking about the indoor air quality, right? CO2, humidity, and temp. So even the efficiency, right, is still, if you will, kind of in question, right? So it's just, again, trying to portray, if Kennedy's the ideal environment, right, we're losing, if you will, on the other 11. And it's weird. We looked at it, and part of the Reveal platform, the software, right, is we can pull up a map. We can see those averages over time. Because one of the things, to Commissioner Ardrey's point, we were looking at, like, is Wilson always in the red? You know, Wilson is not always in the red, right? What about, like, so you're trying to look, like, were all the schools on the south side of town in the red? And they're not, right? Are there you know, just trying to, and they're just all over the board, right? And so we're inconsistent, right? But I think it boils down to one of the things Commissioner Dommerhausen, as a committee and as a board, you're gonna have to wrestle with is this okay? Or how do we address it? And how do we address it as we receive the overall district assessment? What's our scope? What's our prioritization? What can we invest? What do we ask for to invest, right? And how does that all begin to play out over a long-range plan?
Are there commonalities as I'm thinking about what Greg said, that you've got Wilson, Washington, Adams, that were built in a certain era. And then you've got other, you know what I'm talking about now. I'm not gonna even ask, because you know what I'm asking.
Well, I do, right? And Dave can chime in, right? And I think Scott and Kevin and can chime in as well. And Nick, right, is when you look at the map, right, you have a 1930 building and it's maybe in the green on an average for a particular set of time, right? You can look, you know, Monroe's not bad, right? But Kennedy continues to be that shining star, right? So it's just, and again, what time of the year are we looking at it, right? And all of that. So there's no pattern per se. The pattern, I would say, though, is we're inconsistent, and the ideal pattern would be the environment we're providing our students at Kennedy.
I think the other piece is, and we have to keep in mind, is this an ankle biter issue? Or is it more important? So what I mean by that is, the buildings are the buildings, whatever they are. And the performance of our students and along with the staff, you know, does this have a bearing? Well, obviously it has some bearing, but we also can see and know that these things can easily be overcome, because, you know, if you go CO2, well, Monroe, Blue Ribbon School. So obviously it did not significantly affect the snapshot in time with respect to that. So I just want to say, you know, all of this is important, but when we look long-range planning, there are so many things to take into account, and some of these issues are ankle biter issues. Still important, because they're still biting, But it's not like, okay, well, we better make sure we do something about this. It's just one data point to say we have to factor in. So, okay, anything else? Mr. Leader.
You know, so getting back to these building assessments, right? So I've been to each building with several different assessors, whether it's on the mechanical, electric, plumbing, right, side of everything. And these are the type of things like Kennedy, right? We've had an issue, we've known we've had an issue. These are the things that are brought to the front, right? I mean, they've got their own mindset, they know what they need to look at, but it's these things that also need to be compiled. So that's exactly what happens in all these buildings. We know the problem areas, and those problem areas are gonna be related to that assessment team, so they are noted.
Questions, thoughts? Thank you, McKinstry.
All right, thank you.
Scott, Nick, Kevin? All right.
Good, all right. Okay, next steps. We've all looked at the IAQ report. I've identified, obviously, the areas of concern with CO2 measurements. And what I've done is, I've deployed my maintenance staff to each and every one of these buildings. You know, we do routine maintenance all the time, but I need them to take a harder look and to see if there is possibly something that we missed, right? On the other end of that, you know, components of each building, mechanical systems to date, I mean, a lot of these systems were born the day the building was built, 60s, 70s, whatever, it's the same equipment. All this equipment has a life cycle, and we are beyond that life expectancy in a lot of these buildings, and that depicts in a lot of these ratings that we looked at today. So what I've done is I've asked, excuse me, my maintenance team to do a thorough study of all of our exhaust systems and air intakes. So I'm expecting that report back real soon. If I do need some additional help, I will contact a mechanical HVAC company to assist us if it's something that's detrimental. We do have some progress that's going on with our building automation systems. Craig High School, Harrison, Jefferson, Kennedy, Marshall, Parker, Roosevelt, and Van Buren will be receiving a BAS system this summer. So that's good news. We can really kind of wrap our arms around the HVAC equipment. As a reminder, please remember that Franklin is going through an automation system right now as we install all the new HVAC equipment there, very similar to that of Edison that we did back in 2018. Edison, that's got a complete BAS system in it already. We just got one little component that we have to add to that to convert that over to a Niagara system. So that building will be completely automated. Within current budgetary constraints, a district-wide BAS initiative is cost prohibitive. We still have some buildings out there that do have the antiquated pneumatic systems. That'd be very costly to convert that over to a BAS with the existing equipment that we have in place. And again, that goes back to the original equipment that we have in these buildings. Just an example, Franklin, right, who we're converting over right now, had 80% of the building was pneumatic. So if you can picture the compressor, right, down in the boiler room, and then you've got a head-in, what I call tubes and copper pipe system, that one tube could travel 300, 400, 500 feet to serve an air handler. Now this is going through wall cavities, right? Underneath decks, whatever, and God only knows what could happen to those pipes if they've got a pinhole leak in them, right, in a wall cavity. We'd never know. I mean, we'd know because that air handler would probably run 24/7. So it's things like that, you know, there's a lot of unknowns out there with these old systems and what, you know, what's going on behind the scenes that we can't visually see. So as a reminder, the district has undertaken a district-wide facilities and site assessment and long-range master plan that includes heating, ventilation, and air conditioning to be completed by December 24th.
It's 2023, it's my typo.
Did I say 23?
It's supposed to be 23, it's a typo.
Oh, okay.
That's on me.
No, that's okay. So within our current budgetary constraints, mechanical or any HVAC updates are cost prohibitive at this time. So if we had to go into a building and replace a unit ventilator, you're looking at $12,000 just for one unit ventilator. Yes?
I think it's a little bit of what I'm talking about, looking at these. It isn't that they can't be done, they're just not in the immediate future. And we should put them out there to target for if we can possibly find a solution. And that's a little bit of what I'm getting at.
Yes.
We can only have so much money now, the next bucket, there'll only be so much money.
Right.
But maybe another bucket someday, we can pick some of this off.
Exactly, and I think, you know, in my opinion is this, if we're gonna, you know, if we're gonna go after a building, let's go A to Z, right? I mean, really, let's complete it, get it off the list. You know, we're doing that with Franklin, right? 2018, we did the boilers. Now we're doing all the HVAC-related equipment, the air handlers, unit ventilators, right? New piping, getting rid of a lot of asbestos insulation in these tunnels, right? Windows, and then you look at the roof systems, right, replacing those. Now you've got the whole package deal. Now it's really fun to look at that performance of a building when you have everything completed, rather than saying, oh, you know, well, we're here because we didn't do this, right? We're gonna be at the same stage with Edison, right? We did all the HVAC, we did some building envelope work, we didn't do the windows. Single pane windows, that's gonna happen this summer. 24, all brand new windows. So again, another completed building. Yes?
So are the older schools in our district falling farther and farther behind because it's just too costly to go into those buildings and upgrade them?
I'll use Adams as an example. So Adams has had, I believe, 2 other additions to the original construction. And in that building is a low-pressure steam system, okay? When they added on to the building, they put a hot water loop in. So we have different heating sources in that building, right? It'd be nice to get that building converted over to a complete hot water system. You get better heating, right? It's easier to control. Again, kind of like that pneumatic system I talked to you guys about earlier. Steam system's the same thing. You know, you've got steam traps down in tunnels, right? Tunnel is a confined space. You gotta go check that trap. Now you gotta pull a confined space report. There's 3 guys. There's 3 guys to inspect 1 trap, following all OSHA guidelines.
Dave's answer is spot on, right? But the short answer to your question is yes. The older the buildings get, the more inefficient they become, and it's an aging infrastructure, right? And when, Dave, if you want to maybe just even, what are the unit events like at Lincoln? We pick on Adams a lot.
Lincoln, I mean, we have 1955, 58, I believe, I'm sorry, unit ventilators in there, right?
Older than me?
I worked at the county when the county did the study as to upgrading Rock Haven or building a new nursing home. Same with the healthcare center and the sprinkler system, and then there, and you gentlemen know better than I, there's a point where upgrading, fixing, you know, becomes, do we just tear it down, and start over?
Right.
Are we anywhere near that with our older schools, our Wilsons, Adams, anything like that? Because the equipment and everything is so antiquated?
So to relieve some pressure from Dave here.
Thank you.
I'll take the hit on this one, right? So, you're asking great questions, right? Which is why we're trying to give you as much data, and then you'll get that building assessment, right? So again, we want the process to be organic, right? But you're asking the right questions. We're just probably today not prepared to answer them until the committee and the board, right, has all the information they need, and to have that discussion facilitated.
I guess I'm thinking of it, you know, from my thinking, at what point do you continue to pump in money to your vehicle and say, you know what? It's time to get a new car. I can't just continue to put money into this, you know, and I'm not advocating that we tear these buildings down, build new buildings. That's, you know, that's really extreme. But at what point do we say, boy, we're really pumping in and we're putting on a lot of Band-Aids and we're not catching up to where we need to be?
Agreed, right? And while we can present you with data, right, the other things that are not necessarily data, right, other than a community survey perhaps providing the committee and the board with input, right, is traditionally, right, as I look to Janesville, born and bred, you know, committee members, right, is the value of neighborhood schools. Right, I mean, and it's all of that, right, that as a group you'll get to wrestle with.
I'll add a little bit more to that, because I think you guys are doing a great job. And we don't know all the answers. And new questions will pop up as we go along. They always will. But somewhere, we need to find us a space that will allow us to say, okay, here's where we are. This is where we're heading. And we still don't know all the answers because other things could happen. And that, you know, the side of a school could fall down. Heaven to Betsy, it won't, but I don't see that, but who knows? But we have our jobs cut out, not only us, but those that come after us.
Right.
And they just want to be aware, and I don't want people to think that you can't do anything, because you can do things. The question is when, and when can we afford it?
Right.
And that's all. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lader. So I think one of the important things is, if we look at where the district was at 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, we didn't know what we didn't know. So we had no information to operate on at all. So it was take your best guess and go do that. We knew that the maintenance team, much under Mr. Leader, the buildings were as best that they could be. But I'll say, and now I'll go back 15 years. Ooh, I've been here that long. The board as a whole didn't have that was not a priority to look at the buildings per se. So fortunately, over this 15-year period, it's now a part of the conversation, so we can actually look at it. So now we better know what we didn't know, much like student performance. We didn't know it, we didn't know there either, but now we know better. So factoring all of those things, then we will have to wrestle with as a board and as a community is the priority of what we say we want to do, and then the funding associated with that. That comes down to us, so. All right, I won't pontificate anymore. All right. Next item, future committee meeting items. Any items that we want to address that we haven't been? Okay. Seeing none, our next meeting.
Your next meeting will be on December 19th starting at 2:30.
Okay, thank you.
Bring food, right?
No
Bring
presents.
food, 'cause it's
Yeah,
We have to bring it.
yeah,
gonna be long.
we're the board,
Expect a longer meeting.
we're the ones that make the money.
We print it every day, that's why we got Dan here.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you have something?
Yeah, I just, some future
Picture of
things we might want to discuss, and it doesn't have to be, some of the things we don't look at necessarily are, and I think we're going to, but I'd like to hear more about outside the school, the playgrounds, the various things. Who's responsible for them? Is it a PTA? Is it the city? You know, I'm just looking at, and I'd like to see it school by school, so that all children have the same playground equipment as other, because that's just as important to those kids, whether it's during school time, at night, or weekends. They love it. So we have to do what we want to do, and that, as such. So I'd like to see a little bit more. We don't have to do everything, but I sure as heck would like to have some kind of a picture of it at each school, and where should we be putting a little money into or something else. And I think you guys have been working on it, I just haven't been hearing it, so, thank you.
Part of the assessment.
I didn't do it.
Oh, I just said it's part of the full assessment. But I will say that keep in mind, we did at least connect with all of the elementary schools, the updated playground equipment, not all the same. It was what the school agreed that they wanted to and stuff, so we did find that, so. Okay, seeing that we have reached the end of our agenda, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Can I go home?